Welcome to Explicit Instruction, Teaching Skills followed by Retrieval Practice. My name is Kim Snowball and I will be your facilitator today. We have a lot of information just in this one book, but we're going to dive into just learning about how to teach skills using Dr. Archer's checklist. And then we're going to dive into retrieval practice and how to engage students when we're working so that we ask and not tell. So I'm going to shrink my face down so that this is not distracting you and we can focus on content. But welcome. This is an exciting time. So our first step is actually to go to our training guide. The training guide has the link on step 1 to this video, but also it has participant notes. And it's important that you go through and download those so that you can follow along throughout this journey today. So we're going to live in step 1, and then I'll help guide you as we go through step 2 and then finally to step 3 before our session ends. The notes are interactive in the sense that there will be space for you to capture your thinking, but also to fill in some blanks so that you have a guide to the 16 elements and additional information as we go through some videos that will help you reflect on your current teaching practices, as well as maybe some changes that you'll make and intentions that you'll set. Keep an eye out throughout this video for the green tab, little sticky note that'll help you remind yourself to capture the notes into the participant packet. All the foundations of explicit instruction have been intentionally placed within this presentation so that you can be assured that everything is very intentional when we think about explicit instruction and the information that we're going to present today to you. Also, we'll just help you guide yourself in the participant packet by the little blue, light blue tab to keep you in line with where we are with the presentation and the notes. One of my favorite mottos is by Dr. Archer, and I use it constantly with my colleagues, with my family, with in my personal and professional life. It is, if you expect it, pre-corrected. It's just about planning for the future and trying to understand and anticipate errors, misconceptions in thinking, as well as what might happen if I don't set up the expectations or the routines in a way that will help students be productive. The outcomes for today are that you will be able to integrate elements of explicit instruction into your daily practices when you're teaching. And that's whether you're teaching facts or skills. It's also about really understanding the difference between practice and retrieval practice. It's about that judicious practice that we set in these instructional routines. Again, you'll have your participant handout. These are the materials that you'll need today. Don't forget your training guide will have additional links and then just some pencils or pens for you to capture your thinking. The first thing that we're going to do is actually going to jump to step 2. We're going to listen to a little video clip where Dr. Archer explains a little bit, and it's really only a short video clip about explicit instruction. And I feel like it's important that we get to know her as we go through this journey because this is her work. So pause and then go to the link that is in step 2 and just the first link, and then capture your thinking on page 2 of your handout. So as you include that video, understand that Dr. Archer is extremely passionate about this work. There are 16 elements of instruction when we think of explicit instruction, and we've color-coded them so that you, throughout this presentation, will know which ones we're in, and these are the icons I discussed at the very beginning to keep an eye out for. If you are not familiar with explicit instruction, be aware that it really is systematic instruction. It's an approach that includes a set of delivery and design procedures derived from research. It really is engaging students throughout the entire day. It is not sit and get, it is not telling, it is asking. It is creating an environment that is predictable. And so there are, like I said, 16 elements, and we're going to think about what the benefits are for general education and special education. So for students with disabilities, explicit instruction being that systematic approach, it really makes learning more accessible at the crucial junctures during the lesson. So it's really about that engagement piece. It's understanding a little bit about the working memory. And in your participant handout, there will be a link to that article using explicit and systematic instruction to support working memory. So we're thinking about this is really for all students, it's good for everyone, but it is crucial for students with disabilities. Code word number 1 is engagement. Code word number 1 is engagement. Sure. When we talk about explicit instruction being the systematic approach, we still have the attention, review, and preview all in the opening. The body is really where you dive into what are we teaching that day? How is that lesson? And sometimes it's going to be multiple areas. So you might be teaching some facts, but then you might also be incorporating teaching a skill or a strategy that day. There might be vocabulary infused in. And so each time that you think through what is being taught at a specific time period, that's where you pull out different tools. And we'll dive into this in the next slide a little deeper. And then again, just like any great lesson, you need to have that closing where you review and preview. But it is an interactive preview and review. This particular 1-hour session is not going to be targeting really so much the facts and information. We're just going to take a little snippet and review it. We're going to dive deeper into skills and strategies. And then again, we're not going to be diving into the vocabulary and concepts. So when we think about explicit instruction, we do have some misconceptions that, especially from math teachers, when we think about explicit instruction, we might be thinking this is really just giving them more procedures, telling them, but it is about the engagement. It's about students with disabilities can benefit from multiple ways. Explicit instruction is one. We need to make sure we have conceptual understanding where we're talking about students working with manipulatives and exploring concepts. But the point is from Dr. Archer, when she talks about this, is we want to ensure errorless learning of the facts and the skills, as well as that conceptual understanding. So there is an article that I will include in your participant handout, participant handout that talks about it from the math teachers. The title really is Indefensible, Illogical, Unsupported, Counter-Deficit Mythology about the potential of students with learning disabilities in mathematics. And so it does support this, this integrated approach. Like I had said earlier, the 16 elements are broken into, it's kind of color-coded, but they're really broken into 4 different sections. Content, so what you're teaching when you're thinking through that. Then designing of the instruction, how are you going to be teaching it? Then the delivery of the instruction, what do you do? What do they do? And then how do we support this with practice? Because we know that if we just hit it once, then it's really not going to be stuck in long-term memory. And we want the students to be able to have this information to be lifelong learners. The 16 elements on page 2, there is an interactive guided notes page. And I'm going to just put this little note in there for you. Please make sure that when you see the information on the screen, do not fill it in. And I put it in there. There is no mental effort in just copying the notes. We want to be able to retrieve it. So we're going to talk about it. We're going to give you just a little bit of time to digest it, and then I'm going to ask you to retrieve it. And this is what we were talking about at the very beginning. Explicit instruction, retrieval practice. Retrieval practice. We want to live in that world. We want to make it effortful. So let's begin. The first of the 16 elements is really to focus on the critical content, especially in a year where we're looking at maybe some gaps and deficits in student learning. We really want to make sure that the critical content, and many of you have already gone through and looked at your standards and understand what areas we need to make sure we address in the throughout the year to empower students. But we also want to make sure that the critical content is something that students will use in the future. So skills and strategies, terms, concepts, all those that will empower students in the future are considered critical content. Dr. Archer's other Archerisms or motto is cut the fluff and teach the stuff. We need to be thinking everything that we do has to be intentional. And sometimes I've even said explicit instruction could have easily been named intentional instruction. It is about everything that we're doing. We need to be rationalizing it as this is critical. Time is of the essence. We want to make sure we are using students' time wisely. So in content, we also need to be thinking about sequencing skills logically. Those easier skills before harder skills, high frequency skills before low frequency skills. Make sure that we're addressing those prerequisite skills. And then, oh, this is a biggie, similar skills need to be taught separately. We do not want to be confusing. Similar skills need to be taught separately. And then we have our third one, and that will conclude the content portion of the 16 elements. It's breaking down complex skills and strategies into smaller instructional units. It's kind of like that saying, or how do you eat an elephant? You take one bite at a time, and that's how you do it. This is the same thing. Complex skills and need to be broken down so that students can master each one at that stage. Being aware of that working memory overload. And we cannot just dump and not expect that the cup to overflow. These three content elements, they're facts, and as well as all 16. And how do we, as adults, as well as students, have this tool so that we know this information and that we use it in our daily practices? Well, as we're learning today in this 1 hour session, or every time that we have a professional learning, we need to be making sure that we are paying attention. We are going to intend to learn it. And in doing so, then we make that practice of rehearsing it and practicing it in that information in our brain over and over again. But then we also have to periodically retrieve that information, let a little bit of forgetting happen, and then retrieve it. So Dr. Archer, says it's about attention, to intend, to rehearse, to retrieve. That's her big tool for learning facts. Let's go back and let's use a little bit of retrieval. I'm going to ask you to now go in and use the guided notes in just that first content box and fill in 1, 2, and 3. You can pause and then set it aside. At the end, we will go back over them. So please try this today as you're thinking, living and breathing in retrieval practice. Word number 2 is retrieval practice. Code word number 2 is retrieval practice. I hope you were paying close attention. So again, don't copy these down. Just focus on paying attention, being intentional on learning these 16 elements from memory, not because you're copying them down. So number 4, when we're thinking about designing the instruction, we need to make sure that we have a very organized and focused lesson. That anytime that you think students aren't prepared to try to get you off topic, you might be fooling yourself, because I've heard students multiple times say, oh, if we ask so-and-so about their favorite subject, all of a sudden we no longer are talking about math, we're talking about that favorite subject, and we never really get to that part so that we can kind of avoid the homework. So we need to be thinking about anything that we're saying, what are we doing with that time? No irrelevant digressions. So focused lessons. We want to begin with a clear statement, and we usually call that our learning intention or our learning goal. Success criteria is important. We also want to make sure that we review prior skills and knowledge before beginning instruction, and that's with that interactive retrieval practice. And like I said, we'll talk about that a little later, but it really is about asking, not telling. Number 7 is easy to remember. This one: provide step-by-step demonstrations through the entire lesson, and anytime you communicate with students, you need to use clear and concise language. So if there's a vocabulary word that we're not sure our students are familiar with, then we need to make sure that we are explicit about what it means. Number 9, provide an adequate range of examples, and here's a big one, and non-examples. And number 10, provide guided and supported practice. Guided and supported practice. We need time to practice. That's when students are doing the learning, when they're productively struggling and trying to figure out if they've got it or they need to tweak it and ask for help. As we think about our practice, I just want you to think about how often do you give non-examples, and how often do you ask students to retrieve the information later? How much time do you give to students when you're modeling versus the work time when the students are doing the actual work? So let's go now and let's see if we can retrieve this information. Remember, little or no mental effort in just copying. See if you can capture those. Hit pause, and then we'll come back. So now we're going to start into the delivery of the instruction, the third of the 4. Number 11, require frequent responses. This is that engagement piece. When we're delivering instruction, we need to be thinking about you say something, they say something. You say something again, they say something. It is about the interactions between students doing, so that there is no time for them to zone out. We want to have them responding verbally, written, action responses, all of those, whether they're in a virtual setting or whether they're in face-to-face settings. We want students to be able to capture and share their thinking. We need to be able to monitor students' performance closely. And so that's the whole point of the requiring the frequent responses. When they're responding, we're monitoring, we're watching, we're carefully listening, we're jotting down anecdotal notes so that we can cluster students into groups based on what they need. We can also be supporting students with their turn and talks, all of that information, so that we can then, on number 13, provide immediate affirmative and corrective feedback in the moment. When we were talking about, it's during that crucial moment when the students are learning, they need this immediate affirmative and corrective feedback. Number 14, remember, there's nothing more boring than hearing wah, 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 wah. We need to be at a brisk pace, but not too fast that we leave people behind. A brisk pace means that we know our learners and that pace meets their needs. Not too slow that kids are bored. And remember, it's about this delivery approach and knowing our students. And then finally, in helping students organize the knowledge. If we've got it organized, we do know that we have to be keeping in mind, how will students capture this information? How will they store it? And so graphic organizers, ways when we know our students to help them sort the information and come back to that critical content. So let's go back. We've now created an instructional routine. This is helping students organize the knowledge. It's also very predictable because we do not want to take time to try to have students think, Well, how will they ask this information? Where do I write this down? How do I do this? We need to be focused on the content. And so creating instructional routines like this one, where now we're in box 3, you know that we're going to be discussing some content information, the facts, and you've attended to what those facts are. You've been intentional in trying to learn them. You've been practicing the underlined words. That's that instructional routine, so that you can then capture it and retrieve it later to show evidence of learning. So pause, fill in 11 through 15. And now we're on number 16, but one of the most powerful pieces, and if you have the book Explicit Instruction by Dr. Archer, I would highly recommend reading chapter 8 because it's really about the practice. And so we need to provide distributed and cumulative practice. So let's talk about what that really means. When we begin a lesson, if it's the first time students have seen this, this is really about that initial practice. So we give them time to initially practice. Distributed practice is really about spacing out practice. So if it's a critical content area, then we need to be spacing it out throughout the entire unit. Cumulative practice is adding related skills to the existing ones. So that's kind of like breaking those skills down and teaching them separately. But distributed practice is spacing it out, having them recall it later. And then finally, we have this little cumulative review, which is what we want to be thinking of as it's less frequent, but it's still intentional activities to increase long-term memory. What does it look like when we're talking about initial practice? That's that initial mass practice. We're doing it, but if we only give students that, it will eventually fade. And that's why teachers and parents struggle with, well, they said they learned it, but they can't recall it. That's because we have to be intentionally setting our lessons up so that maybe a week later we give them additional practice, just 10 minutes, and then another week later, another 10 minutes, and then another week later, another 10 minutes, and then we have our final assessment. We cannot leave it up to chance. We have to intentionally set times within the units to revisit, and that's part of the schedule. You can also do what we call expanding intervals. So what we just gave you was an equal intervals, but maybe it's 10 days, then it's 20 days, and then we're expanding the intervals. And both of these have equal research supporting their effectiveness. Identify the skills needed for distributed practice. Then determine the length and the type of time intervals between the practice, whether it's equal intervals or expanding intervals. And you'll find a snippet on page 3 of your handout to capture that and remind yourself. So let's go back. Now we've given you a little bit of forgetting time. What's that last and final piece? Number 16, the 16th element. Copy that down. Now I would be remiss if I did not go back through and help you review your answers. So I'm just going to go through the slides, focus on instruction on critical content, sequence skills logically, break down complex skills, and strategies into smaller instructional units. When we talk about the design, it is design, organize, and focus lessons. Focus lessons. Begin the lesson with a clear statement of the learning goals and your expectations. And number 6, review prior skills and knowledge before beginning instruction. Number 7, provide step-by-step demonstration. Number 8, use clear and concise language. Number 9, provide an adequate range of examples and non-examples. And I can't say enough about non-examples. They're so important. Number 10, provide guided and supported practice. When we're talking about delivery of instruction, it's require, and this is require, not hope, but require frequent responses. So we need to set that culture and that expectation. Number 12, monitor students' performance closely. Number 13, provide immediate, affirmative, and corrective feedback. Number 14, deliver instruction at a brisk pace. Number 15, help students organize their knowledge. And then finally, this last one on practice was provide distributed and cumulative practice. So let's take a pause and think about skills. When we are teaching skills, it is about the I do, we do, you do. And Dr. Archer, since 1977, and working with teachers and helping them understand the need for us to understand how this is affected in Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 instruction. In Tier 1, we usually can do an I do, a single I do, a we do, and then the students would do a you do. If students are struggling, then maybe in Tier 2, it's looking more like I do, an I do, then a we do, a we do, a we do, a we do, and then a you do. And if we are working in Tier 3, it really is always about the we. The I do, the I do, the I do. But look at the number of we do's. And sometimes we need to even take a break and then revisit an I do, and I do, more we do's before students really are independent enough to do the you do. And so when we are trying to save time, there are many teachers that will look at it and say, I did it, now you do it. And they skip the we. It is about the we. This is one that I want you to make sure you internalize. If it's not about the we, then you might be wasting that time because the students need that practice. They need that affirmative and corrective feedback during that we portion before they're independent, so we ensure errorless learning. Dr. Archer says in one of her webinars, the effective retrieval practices the finding that long-term memory is increased when some of the learning period is devoted to retrieving the to-be-remembered information. We sometimes call this the testing effect, but it's that pulling that information out. Now, one of the best things that she ever did was describe what this looks like for teachers when we're doing a review. The traditional math review, and I'm doing the math review, it could be any content review, but a traditional math review might be where the teacher stands in front of the room and says something like, remember, when we started this unit, we were talking about integers, and here's some examples of integers, and the teacher talks, and the teacher talks, and the teacher talks. And then, and don't forget, we also talked about rational numbers. And as a math teacher, I give an example of rational numbers with the definition. Then we talk about absolute value. And so I would then just go through the entire big learning targets for the unit before the test the next day. And as I do this with participants in live sessions, I love watching the true, honest reactions. Even for the most avid learners, they are bored, and students are bored. A traditional math review is effortless. We want it to be effortful. So when we think about how can we change this traditional math unit review to incorporate retrieval practice. So a retrieval practice would be same content, different delivery. I ask you, write down the integers from a list, and then you have to critically analyze the information and then jot it down, and I monitor you. Then show me, and then I can applaud or give corrective feedback. Same thing, I have a list. If there's errors, then I can then give you additional time to review, but I can incorporate that definition right in there when we go back and say, oh, I'm sure you had -5 as one of those that you wrote down because it follows this. The whole number, it's not a fractional or digital part. It can be positive or negative. And so I'm reinforcing the information, especially if you might have missed or got some wrong, then you're getting that information that you'll need. It's about reviewing the information in an asking way, not a telling way. And that is the key component for retrieval practice. It's engaging. It's students are doing and the teacher is asking. So when we think about how we incorporate learning, we need to be very intentional. What are we doing to ensure that we are asked students and not always in that tell mode? I'm going to go back now to that skills because in step 2, there's going to be an additional video. It's called Cutting the Onion. And in this video, Dr. Sarah Powell and Dr. Devin Kearns demonstrate the use of explicit instruction. It is very, very, very good. And I can honestly tell you that I watched this video and I felt like I lived in that I do phase. I went and I thought, okay, I am learning a new skill. I want to live in the, I'm living in the I do where I'm watching, they're demonstrating step by step, exaggerating the steps, and they're going through all this little checklist. Okay. But what about the we do? I watched it 4 times and then time went by. I hadn't done any practice. I didn't live in the we do. And I went home and I went to actually make a pot of chili. And I said, I'm going to use that skill that I learned. But all I had lived in was the I do. And I didn't do it right. So then I had to go back and then upload the video, watch it while I was cutting the onion. And that's when it set into me permanently the power of the we do. I needed to think about what was I doing wrong. Okay. And then watch it again and then correct my errors. And now I feel very confident, maybe not in a chef way, but very confident in cutting the onion in the manner at which they demonstrate it. So what you're going to be doing is you're going to be taking the video that I provided the link in the step 2 section of the training guide, and you're going to be using that video to live in this checklist world where you are going and saying, are they living in the during the modeling? Do they do all these things? Do they do the we do in that way? And do they do the you do? Because this checklist is from Dr. Archer, and it is one that will help you internalize the process of teaching a skill. So take some time. This is really a cumulative of maybe 11 minutes of the session where you're going to watch the video, jot down the notes, and capture that. And when you are finished, come back. So you're going to pause, come back, and we'll finish out the session. Code word number 3 is ask, not tell. Code word number 3 is ask, not tell. So now that you have experienced the 16 elements, you've lived in the I do, we do, you do. We've discussed and really internalized the importance of retrieval practice. It's about you setting your intention, about you taking the time to say, I intend to. So write down, it's on page 4 of your participant handout, your intention. Now that you've set your intention, you're ready to go on to step 3, which is applying for the certificate. There are 3 code words that you will put in order as they were presented, and then there'll be 2 additional feedback prompts. And then within 24 hours, you should receive your certificate. Please note that if you put your email in incorrectly, the smallest of a typo, it will not be generated and sent to you, and you'll have to reapply. So be careful and check that twice. Thank you.